Which economic system is the best, capitalism or socialism? Which party has the better economic platform, supporters of big government or supporters of small government? Let's analyze the economics that influence the lives of Americans. Is the problem with America that the rich don't pay their fair share of taxes? Are the rich paying no taxes, while middle America pays all of the taxes? A common claim is that the rich don't pay their fair share, and that the average American pays more taxes than the richest 1% and richest 10% do. This claim is false. Here are some key points about tax rates and tax burdens in the American tax system. Number 1. The top-earning households in America pay very high taxes. For example, the richest households in America may pay approximately 25% to 33% of their total income to the government. They pay high income tax rates on both federal income tax rates and state tax rates. Number 2. When it comes to the total tax burden of income taxes on U.S. citizens, the richest households pay the vast majority of the tax burden. The top 1% pay nearly 50% of the total U.S. federal income taxes, whereas average Americans and the poorest Americans pay a relatively small percentage of the total U.S. tax income. The top 50% highest-earning Americans pay virtually all of the federal income taxes, meaning that the top 50% of productive citizens pay virtually all income taxes in the USA, whereas the bottom 50% of Americans pay virtually none of the federal income tax burden. Number 3. Supporters of high taxes on the rich, such as supporters of taxing all rich people at a 90% tax rate, use historical tax rates to justify their claim. These people claim that we can raise the tax rates on the rich to 90% because that was a policy that existed in the 1950s and the economy was booming during that time. This is false. Income taxes have never been as high as 90% on the rich, such as in the 1950s. While it's true that the 1950s did have a high marginal tax rate on the rich, the effective tax rate on the rich was around 45% in total. So, it is not true that the rich have paid 90% of their income in taxes in the past, because at the end of the day the effective tax rate is often upwards of 45% maximum. Number 4. Middle-class Americans and the poorest Americans are generally net negative taxpayers, meaning that they receive far more from the government than they ever pay into the U.S. tax system. This is contrary to popular belief, which claims that the poorest Americans pay the highest taxes and receive very little. This means that many Americans are cash positive on their taxes every year because they receive more money than they paid in taxes through government transfers. This happens because many average Americans may pay income tax rates as low as 0% to 10% on their income, yet they receive many services back from the government, which makes them net negative taxpayers. Number 5. America has an extremely progressive tax system, whereas other countries like European countries have a much more regressive tax system. A progressive tax system is a tax system where the richest Americans pay the most taxes, while the poorest Americans pay little to no taxes. In contrast, a regressive tax system, such as in Europe, generally has high taxes on their middle-class citizens and poorest citizens. America has a very progressive tax system overall, where virtually all of the tax burden is on the most productive citizens. Number 6. Supporters of ultra-high taxes on the richest households claim that the reason the most productive households should pay high taxes is because they are beneficiaries to all of the services and perks that the United States has provided them. They claim that the rich should pay much of their money back into the system to, quote-unquote, pay it forward. This is a false claim. The truth to this justification is that the basic government responsibilities, such as road infrastructure, national defense, and education, are generally a very small percentage of the entire U.S. yearly budget. For this reason, when the rich pay 33% or more of all of their income in taxes, they don't receive virtually anything back. Meanwhile, average Americans receive benefits which are mostly paid for by taxing the richest households in America. In the next sections, we will break down the top budgetary items for U.S. federal spending. Number 7. Payroll taxes, such as Social Security and Medicare, are progressive tax systems. While it's true that Social Security taxes are only paid on income below $176,000 in 2025, this is not the whole picture. Higher income payers of Social Security receive little back for the money they put in, while the lowest income payers into Social Security receive much more back than they put in once they redeem their money. This means that the Social Security tax system functions as a progressive tax system. In addition to this, the Medicare tax is progressive because Medicare taxes increase as you earn more income. For these reasons, FICA taxes are not a regressive tax system, but rather a progressive tax system, similar to the way that the income tax system is also progressive. In summary, the United States has a very progressive tax system, meaning the highest-earning households in America pay a very high percentage of their income to U.S. federal income taxes, whereas middle-class Americans and the poorest Americans pay little or no federal income taxes. As we'll see in the next section, this means that the high spending of the U.S. federal government is primarily funded by the high taxes generated from the highest-earning Americans. Is the $35 trillion of U.S. debt caused by lack of taxation on the rich? Would we finally be able to pay for government programs like Medicare for All if we just finally taxed all the rich people for their fair share of taxes? The primary cause of the government debt skyrocketing is government spending, not lack of tax revenues from the highest-earning Americans and highest-earning households. Supporters of big government programs, such as Medicare for All and other large welfare safety net programs, claim that the U.S. would be able to fund the spending if the government taxed the rich for their fair share. As shown previously, this claim is false. The highest earning households in America already pay very high taxes, much more than their alleged fair share. And the top earning households in America already pay for the vast majority of the revenue that the federal government receives from taxes. With this in mind, we can see that no amount of higher taxation on the already highly taxed rich would ever be able to pay for the federal government spending. Seizing all of the billionaire and millionaire wealth in America would not hardly pay for any of the budgetary problem, even if you seized 100% of billionaire wealth and 100% of the millionaire wealth in America. Mathematically, we can see that this means the only true culprit of high debt is due to high government spending. Now that we have identified that lack of taxation is not the problem, we are left with one conclusion. The reality of the situation is that the primary cause for the U.S. debt problem is massive government spending. As of 2024, the government is running at over 100% debt to GDP, meaning that the government has more debt than there is gross domestic product in the economy every year. This is analogous to if your family spent more on credit cards every year than your family had in total income, and is a signal of reckless spending. This is fundamentally only able to be caused by high spending, and no amount of high taxation can fund that much spending. Attempts to add even larger government programs, which add trillions of dollars to an already gigantic spending budget, are mathematically impossible because there generally is no way to raise taxes higher. Now, let's break down the top line items for the spending budget for the U.S. federal government. In 2023, the U.S. government spent $6.1 trillion, while the overall GDP of America was $27 trillion. The U.S. government only received $4.4 trillion in tax revenue. Number 1. Social Security spent $1.3 trillion, which is 21% of the budget. Number 2. Government healthcare spending, which is Medicare and Medicaid, spent $1.5 trillion, which is 24% of the budget. Number 3. Income security programs, such as welfare programs, spent $450 billion, which is 7% of the budget. Number 4. Discretionary spending, which is elective spending by Congress, spent $920 billion, which is 15% of the budget. Number 5. National defense spent $800 billion, which is 13% of the budget. Number 6. Net interest spent $650 billion, which is 10% of the budget. As we can see, the top budgetary items causing high spending are mandatory programs, meaning that Congress doesn't need to pass new laws each year for mandatory spending programs like Medicare and Social Security to operate. They continue automatically unless Congress changes the law. In contrast, discretionary spending must be passed each year by congressional bill in order for the money to be spent. In 2023, approximately 60% of the federal spending was spent on mandatory programs, with the remaining budget items being spent on items such as national defense, debt interest payments, and others. The top budgetary items are programs like Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and welfare programs. To give an example of discretionary spending passed by bill in Congress, a good example of this is 2022's Inflation Reduction Act, which spent $500 billion on subsidies for green energy, like solar panels and windmills and electric vehicle subsidies. This is another way in which Congress can add another $1 to $2 trillion in spending each year. An important key point is that nearly 60% to 70% of the budget is spent on welfare and wealth redistribution style programs. This fundamentally means that the rich pay the most and the poor receive the most. These wealth redistribution programs and taxation structures essentially funnel money from the most productive and high-earning Americans and pays this money out to average Americans and the lowest-earning Americans. Often, even middle-class Americans can pay for these wealth redistribution programs. For this reason, it should be understood that almost the entirety of the $6.1 trillion spent in 2023 was related to what is called the welfare state and wealth redistribution type policy. Supporters of more welfare programs and bigger government claim that rich people do not pay taxes and that the poorest Americans do not receive any help from the government. But these two claims are clearly false. The U.S. federal government almost certainly devotes the vast majority of its budget to wealth redistribution style programs and is the sole reason for the ever-increasing U.S. debt of $35 trillion. Programs such as Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and welfare programs cost about $3 trillion to $4 trillion per year. Policies such as Medicare for All and other similar policies that already exist such as the Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, have raised the budget expenditure in the past or would greatly increase the budget expenditure in the future. In summary, the U.S. federal government already taxes the rich highly, while average Americans and poor Americans pay much less. On top of this, the U.S. federal government spends highly, much more than ever could be collected from new taxes on the rich, and much more than ever could be collected from new taxes on middle-class Americans. Now that we know the top budgetary items for U.S. federal spending, we can more accurately analyze the financial situation of the U.S. federal government. Why is the U.S. healthcare system so expensive? Are the skyrocketing costs of healthcare due to free market capitalism? Would the healthcare system be less expensive if it was nationalized, like Britain's National Health Service? A common claim of critics of the U.S. healthcare system is that the prices are sky high, which is true. Critics will then claim that the reason the U.S. healthcare and insurance system is expensive is because of free market capitalism, greed, and corporate profits. This analysis is false. The U.S. healthcare system is not a free market in any way. It is a mixed economy, meaning there are elements of private and public in the same system. Most importantly, due to the amount of regulatory control on the sector essentially functions as a socialist sector and is an example of the failures of socialism, where the government attempts to manage and create arbitrary outcomes in the healthcare sector of the economy. In contrast, European countries have fully socialized and nationalized healthcare systems, although as we will cover later, these systems have many of the same problems that the US healthcare system has. All of the drawbacks and dilemmas of the US healthcare system and the European healthcare systems exist because of socialism and would be entirely fixed if these markets were allowed to be fully privatized and were pro-free market. First, we must understand why healthcare costs are so high. There are two factors that affect healthcare costs. Number one, the population's health in your country. For obvious reasons, if your country has nothing but healthy individuals, your overall healthcare cost will be low right from the start. The US has an extremely unhealthy population, which leads to higher healthcare costs. Number two, the efficiency of your healthcare market. If your market is efficient like a free market system, your cost will be low. If your market is inefficient because of socialism, your cost will be amplified higher. Market inefficiency leads to higher costs and more waste, as opposed to a fully privatized system. Let's break down some of the key ways that government controls the healthcare system. Firstly, the government has health insurance programs, including Medicare, which is a program generally for individuals over the age of 65, and Medicaid, which is a program for individuals with low income. There are many regulations regarding how health insurance must operate. Then, the government has control over healthcare services with bills like the Obamacare Affordable Care Act. Regulations like this control many aspects of the actual administration of healthcare services and many regulations on how the business of healthcare must operate. There are also many other factors which control the supply-side economics of the healthcare market, including organizations like the FDA and regulations regarding how hospitals operate. In summary, all of these controls by the government exist to create arbitrary desired political outcomes, meaning the government directly tries to force certain outcomes that politicians desire. This contrasts with a free market. The healthcare sector is the opposite of a free market, and that is the key reason why the inefficiency of the healthcare market and health insurance market is extremely low, and is the key reason why healthcare costs are extremely high. In terms of total spending, healthcare spending continues to increase every year. In 1980, the US spent 9% of GDP on healthcare spending. Now, in 2020, the US spends about 20% of GDP on healthcare. Supply and demand always exists, even if you have socialized healthcare. The nationalized healthcare systems of Europe suffer similar problems. They often have sky-high costs, which have to be paid for by higher taxes. They often have failing technology and staffing, and are unable to keep up with demand. Because government-run industry cannot adjust to supply and demand efficiently, they often have to ration healthcare and have extremely long waiting lists. As expected, although on a surface level this system of nationalized healthcare may appear free, it actually is a failing healthcare system with subpar value for the consumer, and with sky-high taxes to pay for the allegedly free services, which are only free on a surface level. For these reasons, making the US healthcare system a nationalized healthcare system would not improve outcomes much, and costs would still remain sky-high. Socialized healthcare systems are bad economics, and would be a failure of supply and demand. In fact, increasing government control of the healthcare sector with more socialism and nationalized healthcare would almost certainly increase costs, and over time bankrupt the United States of America. How do we solve this crisis? The healthcare market must be 100% privatized. All elements regarding health insurance and health services must be allowed to operate in a free market, free of government regulation and forcing of arbitrary desired political outcomes. The sky-high costs of the healthcare industry can be entirely attributed to government socialism, meaning when government has massive control over how a sector operates. The only way that would truly bring down costs over time, as well as increase value for the consumer, would be to allow the healthcare sector to be a free market. What about the housing sector? Is the lack of affordable housing the fault of free market capitalism? Would more government price controls help solve the housing affordability crisis? Are high housing costs caused by greedy landlords? Housing is the primary expenditure of U.S. citizens. Changes in home prices can drastically change the financial health of all American citizens, so it is important to understand what affects housing prices. Housing exists in a supply and demand system, so we must understand the economics of the sector. There are a few key reasons why housing is unaffordable in the modern era and factors that affect housing and rent costs. Number 1. House sizes. Houses are larger and more technologically advanced than ever before. In previous decades, houses may have been the size of just a few rooms, for example, being only 1,000 square feet. Now, many houses are much bigger than that, upwards of 2,500 square feet. Houses are also more technologically advanced than ever. In this regard, houses have more value than ever, and of course the price goes up in accordance with this. Number 2. Land availability around cities. There is only so much land around city centers. There are only so many desirable city locations, and only so much land around the city core. The city will just continue to have urban sprawl around its center, and the areas closest to the city will always be most valuable, and there is a limited supply of land. This is an example of supply and demand. In this case, the supply of land around cities is fixed. Number 3. U.S. population goes up over time. The population of the United States continues to grow. The population was 150 million people in the 1950s, and now it is nearly 400 million people. In economics, this is an example of high demand for the same existing amount of land around cities, which would be a fixed supply. For this reason, we can see how demand for housing and land is always increasing, while supply of land in cities is relatively constant, and the availability of new housing units can be slow to increase over time. In addition to this, in the years 2021 to 2023, The U.S. allowed tens of millions of people to enter the southern border of the United States. This is an example of how housing demand can rapidly increase, which will proportionally increase prices for the same existing amount of supply. Number 4. Government zoning regulations. As mentioned, there is only so much land around cities, and some zones are zoned for single-family homes, while others are zoned for apartments. The only literal way to increase the supply of housing in order to meet demand is to increase housing supply by building more houses or more apartments. Number 5. Government environmental regulation and government building regulation. Government regulation has massive control over housing costs. Remember, most businesses in America run at a 5% to 10% profit margin, including rental businesses. In this regard, if the cost of running a rental building go up, or the cost to build new housing goes up, this cost will be passed accordingly to the consumer. In places like California, new housing units are often denied due to environmental regulations. In this regard, new housing units may be rejected if there is a rare animal species, or a rare plant species, or any other arbitrary environmental issue that is found by environmentalists, and in this manner environmentalists and government have full control over housing supply. It is a common story to hear about how construction companies must spend years doing environmental studies to determine the environmental impact on a piece of land, even if the environmental impact is going to be non-existent. This wastes years of time on trivial regulatory issues before any housing is ever allowed to be built. This increases housing prices accordingly. Other factors around housing costs, like if the government has over-the-top regulation about building materials or safety codes, can increase the cost of building by 25% to 50% or even 100%. This is not to say that there should be no safety codes, but rather that there likely exists many regulations that do not increase the safety or quality of housing almost at all, but increase the cost to build new housing exponentially for no improvement in safety or value. Number 6. Government price controls. Many cities in the U.S., such as New York City, have some form of price controls. These units have price caps, or only allow the rental price to go up a certain percentage per year, such as 2% maximum increase in rent price per year. As covered previously, price controls are very anti-free market, and do not adhere to the laws of supply and demand. Essentially all that happens is that the price of running an apartment building goes up with time. The price of rent that the landlord can charge does not go up. As expected, the landlord either closes the business because of government price controls, or does not spend any money maintaining the building, because the government has completely destroyed the profit margin of the business and forced it to run at a loss. Price control policies are very popular with the general populace because they sound like they would fix the problem of high rent prices, but they are often a misunderstanding of supply and demand. As expected, they lead to disasters in the market, leading to everyone losing. The consumer has less apartments to choose from and less quality apartments, and the landlord is not able to build new housing units because the government has forced price controls onto the business, making it a guarantee that price control buildings will run at a loss. While media and politicians will criticize apartment buildings for being greedy or raising rent to line their pockets, this analysis is false. Rent exists on an open free market, meaning you must compete with others, and consumers are free to not trade with you. In this regard, there is no such thing as raising rents as much as you want, because no one would trade with you. As mentioned, most businesses, including rental buildings, likely run at a 10% profit margin, and prices adjust dynamically. All policies of price controls lead to disaster and destroy availability of rental units in a city like New York City. Number 7. Government-subsidized housing. Government itself runs housing in places like New York City. Entire sections of the city are set aside to be affordable housing, meaning the government heavily subsidizes the rent and construction. As expected, whenever the government itself attempts to function as a business or interferes in the free market, disaster ensues. These units are often poorly constructed and managed, do not use land efficiently, are low-quality apartments, and have massive crime problems. All of these factors means the market has less value to offer than if the government did not interfere. The free market itself would be able to offer more value to the consumer. In summary, the housing market itself is not strictly an ideal free market system. It is not the fault of the free market that there are inherent issues with supply and demand in the housing sector. It is not the fault of the free market that the government has massive regulatory control over housing and rental buildings. Unfortunately, this much government control exists because housing is the primary expense of American citizens, so there is a moral component to it, which is then used to justify government interference in the free market. The best solution to affordability of housing and rentals is to allow as much free markets as possible, where people are able to freely trade their money in exchange for products and services. This would lead to more housing supply, lower prices, and better quality housing and rental units. Was the 2008 financial crisis caused by the failures of free market capitalism? Was the unchecked greed of the big banks the cause of this crisis and the Great Recession? Would more government regulation prevent this disaster from occurring in the future? The 2008 financial crisis, which was a crisis of home loans being given to those who could not afford to pay them, is a very complex topic. For this reason, many people look to opinions by mainstream media for their explanation of what happened. In movies like The Big Short, the movie exclusively places the blame for the 2008 financial crisis on the shoulders of the big banks, and places the blame of the crisis on the greed of capitalism. Because of media like this, it is accepted amongst average Americans that the reason for the financial crisis was because free market capitalism is dangerous without strong regulations, and that only more government control can solve this dilemma of free market capitalism. This analysis is false. The 2008 financial crisis was 100% caused by government policy and government regulation. Essentially, this level of control is not a free market, but rather de facto socialism, where the government is able to force arbitrary desired political outcomes in the markets. Greed and free market capitalism was not the cause of the financial crisis. Essentially, the crisis happened because home loans were given to low-income earners, who fundamentally could not afford these home loans. As a result, $5 trillion or more of value was destroyed in the economy and bailed out by the government. Now, let's break down the true causes of the financial crisis. Number 1. The banking and financial services sector is one of the most highly regulated sectors in the entire economy. Government politicians and bureaucrats can often force outcomes and are often able to determine if banking businesses live or die through use of regulation. At the time of the 2008 financial crisis, the sector was still highly regulated. Despite all of the manpower and expertise dedicated to regulation by the federal government, many in the government were entirely unaware of the problems that caused the crisis until the crisis finally happened. Number 2. The government had massive control over the home lending business through the use of government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Freddie and Fannie are giant government-sponsored enterprises that never would have existed in a free market. Their liabilities and debts are guaranteed by the U.S. government. Because of the U.S. government guarantee, they were highly incentivized to maximize their leverage. Banks could underwrite these home loans and sell them to Fannie and Freddie, who would take on all of the risk, and all of the risk was guaranteed by the U.S. government, because Fannie and Freddie were government-sponsored enterprises. In this regard, banks essentially had no risk in giving out home loans and simply collected their fee. Their behavior was mandated by law from Congress and the president. Number 3. The government had massive control over the rating of subprime mortgage bonds through use of government-sanctioned rating agencies such as S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. They were the only rating firms that the Securities and Exchange Commission allowed to provide credit ratings on bonds to meet requirements for public pension plans. For this reason, when bonds rated AAA were actually C in quality, what appeared to be low-risk financial instruments were actually very risky and caused massive losses for buyers of these financial instruments. Number 4. The government, through presidents like Bill Clinton and George Bush, mandated that at least 50% of the portfolios of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac be composed of subprime affordable housing loans given to low-income borrowers. Essentially, the government itself mandated that lending standards would be massively lowered in order to reach this unobtainable goal. Forcing home loans to be given to low-income households who could not afford them introduced massive risk into the home loan market, which ultimately exploded and destroyed trillions of dollars in value. The goal of presidents like Bill Clinton was to increase home ownership among historically underserved communities who could not afford home loans because of their low income. Bills such as the Community Reinvestment Act caused this behavior. Politicians desired that lower income groups, such as the African American community, would have higher home ownership rates. For this reason, the political desires of politicians and presidents led to government-mandated outcomes and lowering of lending standards. On top of this, any of the risks associated with lending to risky borrowers was guaranteed by the U.S. federal government. Number 5. The Fed, which controls interest rates, held interest rates very low during this period, which amplified the existing economic activity and amplified the existing risks created by all of the government interference in the home loan market. Number 6. Free market capitalism and greed did not cause the crisis. Greed is a constant factor among both businesses and consumers at all times. This argument essentially assumes that one day all of the banks simultaneously decided to massively increase their leverage with reckless home loans to people who could not afford to pay them. Rather, as covered previously, this behavior of the banks only existed because of the incentives and forced outcomes mandated by the government's policy. In summary, free market capitalism did not cause the 2008 financial crisis. Government mandates and laws, desiring to create arbitrary political outcomes, was 100% responsible for the crisis. What about the U.S. college system? Isn't that an example of free market capitalism failing the average American in the modern age? The total student loan debt in the USA currently sits at around $1.75 trillion in 2024. It continues to rise every year. But why is that? Is this a signal about the failures of capitalism because students cannot afford to pay off their student loans? As usual, this difficult economic situation is almost entirely caused by the government and its policy. The government itself guarantees student loans so that as many people as possible can go to college. This is why you cannot ever declare bankruptcy and get out of your student loans. Because the government is guaranteeing the loans, this allows the students to major in fields that are not economically viable. This essentially means that students will not make a return on their investment for their time and money spent in college. Although, this is not true for students who major in fields like STEM, who can easily pay for their loans. The government essentially incentivizes bad economic behavior, and for this reason, the idea of student loan forgiveness is now another tool that politicians can use to win votes. School tuition is rapidly rising, likely due to the fact that government policy is artificially raising demand for the product that the universities provide. Because of this, prices rise. As expected, even a one-time fix of student loan forgiveness would not solve the problem. As with any policy, the incentives create the outcomes. Since the policy is set up for people to fail, the problem will continue to exist for as long as the policy exists. The student loan bubble will exist for as long as the government interferes in the free market. As with any industry, there are calls for the government to make college free for all. As covered at length, the government moving in the direction of free college has already shown its negative consequences. And as with any socialist government institution, if government is in charge, whether fully or just partially, outcomes are always affected negatively. There is no such thing as free college. It would simply be yet another exceedingly large tax burden placed on all Americans. Private loans for student loans do exist. But, as expected, they are almost exclusively given to people that prove they will be able to repay them by majoring in fields such as science and technology, the same way that someone applying for a home loan would have to prove they are able to make an income. This is a natural exchange, unlike when the government gets involved and creates arbitrary and artificial outcomes, and as always, leads to massive economic consequences in the negative direction and creates yet another financial crisis. Why does poverty exist in America? Is poverty a failure of capitalism? Would redistributing all of the wealth of America's billionaires and millionaires fix poverty once and for all? In 2023, only approximately 10% of Americans lived in poverty. Because this number is so low, meaning that poverty is actually quite uncommon, this means there should be a logical explanation for why poverty exists. Poverty typically exists for statistically obvious reasons. Generally, factors such as not graduating high school, not having full employment, having children before marriage, and having a criminal history or history of drug abuse can all be key causes according to statistics. For these reasons, poverty is an uncommon situation and is mostly a cause of personal decisions. Poverty will always exist. Besides poverty, many people in America can be classified as middle class, and many can be classified as poor. When it comes to the poor and middle class, the best way to improve their financial situation is to reduce taxes and improve the economy with more free market capitalism. What if the government had programs and policies that attempted to end poverty? Couldn't the government tax highly and give that money to the poor? The war on poverty is a government policy that has spent countless trillions trying to eliminate the condition of poverty, while ironically the existence of poverty often remains unchanged, while endless money continues to be spent on the problem. It is commonly said that the war on poverty focuses on the symptoms of poverty and almost never the actual causes of poverty. As mentioned previously, the causes of poverty are very often self-inflicted and can be avoided, according to statistics. But, besides self-inflicted poverty, if even a working stable household who does everything right is struggling to pay their bills, this is still a real problem. Luckily, over the long run, it is easy to show that people who live intelligently and save money will over the long run have financial security. Although this does not mean that normal people will ever get rich, but they often will be able to survive comfortably. Another important note is that for the many reasons that working stable households struggle, such as housing, cars, and taxes, can all be helped the more free market a system is. The free market will bring down housing costs and improve quality. The government lowering taxes on average households will help them survive financially. If the market is working badly, very often the culprit is government policy. A primary player in the war on poverty is welfare. In many cases, welfare is a system where people simply live off the government and work less because the government policy incentivizes it. War on poverty policy incentivizes more welfare, while spending countless hundreds of billions of dollars without any fixing of poverty itself. The war on poverty attempts to have a top-down fix on an economic problem, while poverty and its causes itself are very often a bottom-up situation. Intelligent policies, not government welfare spending, would fix the issue of poverty. Examples of these policies would include policies that incentivize full employment in two-parent households, removing incentives that encourage not working, and tax breaks for productive families and families who have children. It is always important to remember that no one is entitled to money redistributed from others. Another unintended consequence of a government welfare state is that it effectively allows politicians to bribe voters. If the government has the power to distribute money to average Americans, this essentially will lead to political parties using more government handouts as a means to directly buy votes. This is not a stable situation for a democracy to exist in. How do we fix the cycle of poverty? For groups of people in America who have had generational poverty for decades, what steps can the government take to fix this problem? A common problem in America is that many groups of people in America grow up in high poverty areas, and it is highly debated why certain areas have cycles of poverty. An objective key factor of why otherwise capable individuals could lift themselves out of poverty is the fact that certain areas have extremely high crime rates. When the majority of the populace is able to work and live normal productive lives, while a certain percentage of the populace brings immense crime into an area, that stunts the opportunity that people living and growing up in that area may have. For example, a high-crime area may have otherwise had access to many common local companies, such as grocery stores. Once crime ramps up in a community, these stores often close, due to the fact that theft or violence is so high in their stores and in the surrounding areas. For this reason, these stores are not able to make money due to the theft, and so they close. This leads to less availability of resources for consumers and less job opportunities for the local working people. Due to this, the normal populace is not able to provide for themselves because the fact of crime in the local area has removed all the opportunity in the area, removed economic prosperity, and often brought violence. When average Americans are caught up in these circumstances, they will often find it difficult to get started in their working life, or afford the ability to move to a better area with more opportunity, or have access to quality schools. All of these are negatively impacted by the presence of high crime. What is the solution to this problem? The solution to the crime problem in America is a large topic, but there are a few key factors that will fix the crime in the local area and therefore improve the economic lives of the people of that area and lift them out of poverty. A common claim is that practices such as price controls would stabilize the economy and prevent corporations from extorting the average American. Is there any truth to these claims? An economic system only exists as supply and demand. Supply is how much of a product or service exists, and demand is how many people are desiring to buy it, or how much they will pay for it. Prices in an economic system are dynamic. They both raise and lower dynamically, in accordance with how much it costs a company to make a product and how many consumers want it. There is rarely such a thing as corporate greed and price gouging, because all products exist in a supply and demand system. There is always fair competition, and consumers will only pay so much for a product. If every time a price raises it is price gouging, then whenever price lowers is it corporate compassion? To critics of capitalism, every time a price goes up, it is price gouging. If a price goes down, it is undercutting competition. If prices stay the same, it is colluding with other companies. The reality is that economics exists in a dynamic supply and demand system. Attempts to denounce companies as price gouging or other similar moral accusations, the vast majority of the time are the result of a poor understanding of economics and often lead to a call for government socialism which controls many factors in the economy. Price controls are a dangerous misunderstanding of economics. If a price raises, it is likely because the cost of that product has increased, assuming there is a free market with competition. By artificially capping prices, for example with rent controls, that often simply means that the business is now running at a loss. If the business is at a loss, they will shut down. Ironically, rent control will actually cause prices to go up. When you destroy the ability for profit, all companies running a real estate business will shut down. This will artificially remove rental buildings from the market, causing a small amount of supply to remain, with the same large amount of demand, ironically leading to even higher rent prices. This is why ideas like price controls, such as rent control, are misguided. Rental and housing prices are a complex system. There is only so much land around city centers. Rental units and housing units have more features and technology over time, and building regulation can go up with time. All while population in cities can continue to go up exponentially over time. This leads to less supply, because of the cost of building new housing, while demand is ever growing. This is a primary reason why rent and housing costs go up over time. Having a fair free market, where new housing units can efficiently be built, can help solve this problem. The government interfering in a free market, consisting of fair competition and supply and demand, can often ironically destroy the market they are trying to help, causing consumers to have to pay massively inflated prices for even less products and lower quality products. Another important note is that all people in an economic system are greedy. A corporation desires to make profit. An individual consumer desires to get the most value out of their money and desires to save it carefully. There is nothing morally wrong with being wise with money, saving money, and looking for a return on your money. What is supply-side economics, and how is it different than demand-side economics? Why does it matter if American entrepreneurship is strong, and how does that affect the consumer? Supply-side economics, also commonly called trickle-down economics, is a way of looking at economics that focuses on the ability of businesses to operate as successfully as possible. In the thinking of supply-side economics, strong businesses are the cornerstone of the economy, from which all positive economic outcomes appear from, including products and services the consumer can benefit from, and high-paying jobs for the working class. Critics of supply-side economics will point out that poor people still exist despite decades of pro-business policies, and also that average Americans did not have millions of dollars deposited into their bank accounts. Critics may also point out the fact that wealth inequality exists in America. Based on this, they will argue that the wealth did not actually trickle down, like people such as Ronald Reagan suggested it would. This is a strawman of supply-side economics, and does not represent the idea accurately. Let's analyze some of the key points of supply-side economics. Number 1. Supply-side economics creates opportunity. It does not miraculously redistribute wealth and eliminate poverty. Supply-side economics, commonly referred to as trickle-down economics, does not function as some sort of benevolent welfare state, where money is magically deposited into the bank accounts of all Americans. The existence of poverty and the existence of strong businesses are entirely unrelated. Rather, supply-side economics functions as an increase of opportunity. This increase in opportunity includes higher-paying jobs and more availability of jobs, as well as new products and services that consumers benefit from, many of which have been invented just in the last 100 years. Number 2. The primary measure of the success of supply-side economics is the total value in the economy, also referred to as quality of life, that is available to all Americans, especially modern technologies that are commonplace even among the poorest Americans. In this light, we can see that supply-side thinking argues that everyone in the economic system has a higher quality of life, through opportunity through modern jobs and modern products and services. For this reason, it is a strawman to describe supply-side economics as a failure, just because every American does not have $1 million in their bank account. Rather, the primary measure of the benefit to the average American is the improvements in economic value they have access to, and their improvements in quality of life, which comes from improvements in supply-side factors. That is why critics of supply-side economics are incorrect when they describe supply-side thinking as a failure, solely because of the fact that poor people still exist and that all people are not magically rich overnight. The general goal of supply-side economics is to increase productivity, which can include innovation of new products and services or increased efficiency of the creation of products, such as the use of automation in factories. Supply-side innovation and efficiency has led to all the greatest products from the last 100 years, including railroads, airplanes, cars, mobile phones, air conditioning, clean drinking water, improved automation in factories, and countless other examples. All of these products and services are not functions of demand-side economics, simply desiring that such useful products would exist, but rather the fact that entrepreneurs on the supply side innovated and made businesses and technology better. In contrast to this, economies which focus on demand-side factors, such as having a very unfriendly business environment, very high taxes on the most productive businesses and individuals, and large welfare states, all generally have very low economic growth and innovation, and generally have high costs over time due to a lack of efficiency. Number 3. Supply-side economics and demand-side economics are very different economic viewpoints. But what is the difference between supply-side economics and demand-side economics? Here is a simple explanation of the difference between these two approaches. Imagine the year is 1990. The product of the iPhone does not exist, and primitive cellular phones were a very new device and were very undeveloped. If you believe that the government doubling the money supply by printing 100% more money into existence and distributing all of the newly printed money into the hands of consumers would instantaneously create the iPhone out of thin air, then you are likely a believer in demand-side economics. If the fact that consumers have money they would trade for an iPhone is enough of a justification for the iPhone to have been invented, then you are likely a believer in demand-side economics. Conversely, supporters of supply-side economics see this event of the creation of the iPhone very differently. If you believe that the iPhone required Apple to innovate on behalf of the consumer, to imagine new use cases, and create new technologies and software that did not yet exist, then you might be a believer in supply-side economics. This process of innovation and improvement in technology is not a process that is achieved strictly by money being thrown at the problem. It is primarily achieved by ingenuity and inventiveness of the business by staff at Apple while they were creating the iPhone. Now that the iPhone product itself has been created, let's talk about the production of the iPhone and the administration of the corporate structure required to distribute the iPhone. If you believe that the efficiency and production capacity of the factories that make the iPhone requires innovation and critical thinking by the businessman, you might be a believer in supply-side economics. In contrast, a demand-side economic supporter might imagine that all of the details described were not caused by supply-side factors, but rather from the fact that consumers would find value in the iPhone and that consumers would appreciate a lower price. This simple example shows the differences in thinking between supply-side economics and demand-side economics. Supply-side economics generally thinks of the economy as a growing pie, where the more free markets and innovation is allowed to happen, the larger the pie can get. And importantly, the lower the taxes there are, the more of the profits the businessman is able to keep for himself, and the more the businessman can reinvest into the business and innovate on behalf of the consumer. Number 4. Having low taxes for the most productive businesses and individuals does not mean you are stealing from the lower class. Allowing productive individuals to keep more of their rightfully earned money is not unjust or robbing the poor. Critics of supply-side thinking will criticize the fact that tax cuts did not make poverty disappear overnight, and is used as a way to show that supply-side thinking, through means of tax cuts, clearly doesn't work. This analysis is incorrect. An important note is that tax cuts do not function the same as welfare payments. Critics of supply-side thinking will criticize the fact that the rich get richer due to tax cuts on their businesses. Firstly, the actual group of people we are talking about are the businesses themselves and their shareholders, which includes many thousands of entities and individuals. There is no monolithic, evil, greedy, monopoly man type of rich people. This caricature is a strawman, which attempts to cast those who make money as being evil and morally incorrect, often as a justification for why all of their profits should be taxed and redistributed to others. Secondly, tax cuts are simply keeping more of the profits from money that you earned through voluntary free trade. In contrast, the government sending free money to people is not at all the same as keeping more of the money you earned. Number 5. Demand-side thinking suggests that government can simply legislate more products and services to appear, and that government can miraculously legislate lower prices for consumers. In reality, only supply-side factors can create new products and services, and only supply-side factors can increase efficiency of production over time, which brings down prices. As seen with all strong capitalist systems, over time the value provided by products and services goes up, and costs lower dramatically over time. This is thanks to the power of supply-side economics. The government cannot legislate or dictate that the economy becomes better, and that more products and services appear, and that better prices appear. This is more of a demand-side economics line of thinking. Many places on planet Earth today do not have access to basic essentials that America has access to, such as fresh water, air conditioning, cars, or medical technology. Unfortunately, this means that the places on planet Earth that do not have strong business environments will not be able to provide these products and services. Simply desiring that clean water treatment plants exist, as demand-side economics would see it, is not enough for them to appear. You must have a stable economic system, which respects property rights and helps businesses operate. The government cannot pass a law that makes businesses innovate, or pass a law that makes businesses become more efficient and bring down costs. Government cannot legislate that new products and services that people benefit from, such as railroads, airplanes, mobile phones, air conditioning, or any of the other improvements in the last 100 years, appear out of thin air to serve the populace. These innovations only exist because of a strong pro-business environment, meaning a strong supply-side environment. Number 6. The policy prescriptions of supply-side and demand-side are very different. Let's see some examples. What would be the economic policies of these two different approaches? Firstly, supporters of supply-side thinking are likely to support minimal regulations by the government in order to allow business to run smoothly, and very low taxes on businesses and individuals to allow future potential growth and business innovation. Both the business itself and the consumer benefit from the strength of companies improving over time, leading to higher value and lower cost products and services. Secondly, supporters of demand-side thinking are likely to support money printing and government spending in order to stimulate economic growth. They would likely support the idea that the government should guarantee jobs, even if the jobs are not productive, such as digging a hole and then filling up the hole. They are likely to support high taxes on the most high-earning businesses and individuals in order to redistribute that money to the lower class through means of welfare payments or more government public services. As we can see, the policy prescriptions of these two different approaches are vastly different. In summary, we can see why supply-side economics is an essential factor in the economy. It leads to improvements in value over time and reduction in price over time. That is why it is important to focus on supply-side factors, such as having minimal regulation that does not get in the way of business operations and having as low taxes as possible to allow supply-side economics to work as strongly as possible. Strong supply-side factors improve the economic situation of both American businesses and the American consumers. What about the fact that the healthcare system and others have a profit incentive? What if the government ran these sectors themselves so that only the quote-unquote common good was at the forefront of decision-making? The irony of the economic system is that if you actually want to achieve the common good, the fastest way to do that is to allow as much free market capitalism, including profit, to occur as much as possible and as freely as possible. There are 3 essential economic outcomes. Number 1, quality of product or service. Number 2, availability of the product, also called scarcity, which is caused by the amount of production available for a product or how fast a service is able to be administered, such as in healthcare settings. Number 3, price of the product or service. Whenever a profit motive exists, a business owner is directly motivated to improve all 3 factors. His reward will be more profit. The profit, even though it makes the business owner richer, is what directly leads to the industry becoming a better service and experience overall. Classic examples of government socialism at work, such as the public school system, the DMV, and healthcare services in both the USA and European nations. These are all services that have many problems. There are a few key reasons why socialism having control over products and services is a bad idea. Number 1. If a government institution is failing in service quality, it is always defended as being underfunded and will get a budget increase. An easy example of this is the public school system. Despite the fact that American schools are very well funded and budgets are continuously increased every year, the first defense of this example of government monopolization is that schools are underfunded. Clearly, the problem is not the budget, and throwing more government money at a problem does not make the administration of a product or service become high quality or efficient. The problem is that capitalism and government socialism fundamentally have very different incentive structures, which lead to vastly different outcomes. Number 2, corruption and lack of efficiency is fundamentally inherent to government-run services, whereas inefficiency, waste, and poor customer experience is relatively unlikely in a capitalist sector. No amount of anti-corruption legislation will ever solve the inherent corruption and waste that occurs in government-run services. Meanwhile, capitalism directly has an incentive for increasing quality and customer experience because of the profit motive. If a company has inefficiency or corruption or fails to compete with other businesses, then it will fail. All of the losses of the company are the investor's money alone, whereas if the government runs businesses at a loss, or there is massive corruption, then the taxpayer is the one losing money. The government essentially has an infinite money supply that it can always rely on, which is taxpayer money or just simply printing more money. Number 3, government sectors and departments are incentivized to spend 100% of their budget, because if they do not spend it, the budget will be lowered in next year's budget. As expected, budgets are always forever increasing. For all of these reasons, free market capitalism is the best way to achieve the common good. The fundamental incentive structures of government socialism and nationalization of industry are completely incompatible with the administration of products and services in an economy, in both the short term and the long term. Profit motive, rather than being a negative trait that leads to nefarious and evil outcomes, actually leads to the best possible outcome for the consumer. Does rich people being allowed to exist cause problems for the average American? Are successful companies a net negative to the average American? Rich entrepreneurs are actually a sign an economy is working for everyone. The more value a business provides to the market, the more money they will make. The more difficult the problem an entrepreneur solves, or the more advanced the technology of their product or quality of their product, the more money they will make. And most importantly, the more value the consumers will receive for each dollar spent. Ironically, the vast majority of the wealth created by entrepreneurs who become millionaires and billionaires is reaped by others. If Jeff Bezos made $100 billion for himself through the value of his stock, it actually means he created multiple trillions of dollars of wealth for everyone else in the economic system. Firstly, the consumer is receiving the service of the Amazon website and shipping, a business that has allowed e-commerce to become mainstream, packages to be delivered in a timely manner of just a few days, and all while keeping prices relatively low and competitive to traditional stores. Jeff Bezos may have made $100 billion, but trillions of dollars of value were created in the economy and reaped by others. The consumer gets a valuable product or service, employees of the economy get jobs, government gets large amounts of tax money through taxing the income of employees and through corporate profit tax, and stockholders receive returns on their investment. When it comes to appreciating stock values, it's important to remember a large percentage of stock in the USA is held by American households. Whenever American businesses succeed, individual investors benefit as well. All of these examples are ways in which a rich entrepreneur creating billions of dollars for himself ended up creating trillions of dollars in value for everyone else in the economic system. Think of all of the value that a company like Microsoft, Google, or Amazon brings to you. Their expertise in the technical realm brings you an immense amount of value through the services they offer you, like Google Search, YouTube, Microsoft Windows, and Amazon Shopping. The consumer may only spend a few $100s on any of these services per year, while receiving an amount of technological value in return unheard of in all of human history. These are also some of the best-run businesses in the world, with profit margins of nearly 25%. It is important to know that most businesses on planet Earth have a much more conservative profit margin, of only approximately 5% to 10% per year, after all costs and taxes are paid. There is rarely such a thing as a company drowning in profits. Every company works hard to maintain their profit margin and avoid bankruptcy. Those profit margins are the reason all companies are able to pay their employees and invest in the future of their company. Should taxes be as high as possible, so that money is circulated through the system, and so that money is redistributed back to the poorest Americans? Lower taxes are essential for economic growth. In systems where taxes are as high as 50% or more, there is virtually no incentive for workers or entrepreneurs to improve their economic output. If rich entrepreneurs are taxed too highly and too unfairly, then economy would not grow, which would hurt average Americans most of all. Imagine an economy with 90% tax rates, for example, on all money made above $1 million. The businessman would have absolutely no incentive to keep generating money for the economy once he hit the 90% marginal tax rate. For this reason, the businessman himself may still be a rich millionaire, but everyone else in the economic system is not benefiting from the value he is able to provide through entrepreneurship, innovation, jobs, or more tax revenues. Even though the rich businessman is being taxed highly and this creates more tax revenues, this is actually worse for everyday workers. Anytime a businessman makes money, the rest of the people in the economy reap most of the benefits through the growth of his business and its profits and the jobs it creates and provides. That is why a policy of ultra-high taxes on entrepreneurs will ironically make the poor people even poorer in a long-term economic sense. Lower taxes allow businesses to have more profits left over after costs, which allows them to invest in their companies, growing in technological value and employees. Counterintuitively, lower taxes also allow the economy to grow larger more rapidly, leading to higher tax revenues over time, potentially more tax revenues than if you had higher taxes. This is called the bigger pie effect, which describes the economy as a whole growing to the benefit of everyone. Businesses need to keep most of their profits, because they will always need cash reserves to pay their employees and all potential expenses, as well as grow the business in the future. If tax rates are too high, you fundamentally endanger the ability of corporations to have savings and not go bankrupt, and if companies go bankrupt, all workers lose their jobs. For all of these reasons, low taxes for everyone are a net benefit for everyone in the economic system. In capitalism, every individual and business functions as a node in a system. Each node is able to decide for itself what the best actions are to offer more value to the economy, how to save money, and how to make more money. In a governmental socialist system, the government runs businesses, but virtually always lose money in the long run and bankrupt the state. The government fundamentally does not have any of the incentives that private businesses do. It does not have incentives to improve products, services, and execution of the business, because it does not matter if the services are high quality, they just need to be good enough to qualify as the government having done its job. The government itself technically has an infinite piggy bank. It does not necessarily have an incentive to not go bankrupt the way that private businesses do. An example of this is the fact that the Soviet Union had a much smaller selection of cars and housing, which lead to far worse outcomes than the free market West. As long as it was good enough, the citizens had to accept it. After all, it was a free car. The USSR continued in its dream of communism until it essentially collapsed. Another key point is that the government itself is a monopoly. Often by removing private enterprise from a sector in an economy, in an effort to remove monopolistic behavior, monopoly behavior is immediately replaced by state actors. A state monopoly which also has full rights to take individuals' money through taxation, as well as force products onto its citizens, would be the case if the government ran entire industries in the economy. This effect can likely be seen in European nations where healthcare systems are fully nationalized. Average citizens pay high taxes, such as 50% of their income for starters, while often receiving healthcare which is low availability, long wait times, and low quality of service. On top of this, government projects are infamous for being multiple times over budget, behind schedule, and low in execution quality. Governments alone, functioning as a monopoly in the political realm, as well as the economic realm when socialist elements control the economy, can often be prime targets for corruption. In virtually every government on Earth, the more power a government has, the more rapidly the state can tend towards corruption. And when corruption takes over, there is never an easy way to fix the system. This sort of behavior is much harder to be achieved in a free market system, because no one entity is likely to have full control over any specific industry, and in the government's case, they also have the power of forced taxation and legal imprisonment for any who do not follow their rules and laws. As previously covered, the government structure fundamentally does not have any of the incentive systems that any private individuals do, and that is why their outcomes are never as good as private enterprise in a free market. Should the government run as many industries as possible? Wouldn't it be better if all citizens benefited from free government services? What about the fact that the government already provides free services now? In the debate of capitalism versus socialism, people will often bring up the fact that government already provides many services that everyday people benefit from. Using this logic, a proponent of government socialism will then assert that everyone likes socialism because it already exists today, and is used even by conservatives who favor small government and free markets. If we simply expand more government control to the economy, then that means everyone will be perfectly provided for, and no one will live in poverty. This is a false analysis. There are two types of government socialism when it comes to the government's role in the economy. Number 1. Services which only the government can provide. There is a short list of services that fundamentally only the government monopoly will ever be able to provide. These services include national defense, public infrastructure such as roads, police departments, fire departments, public utilities such as water, and public utilities such as electricity and power lines. The most essential role of the federal government is to protect the rights of its citizens, and that is why national defense and law enforcement is the responsibility of the government. Other services, such as utilities like water or electric, or public infrastructure like roads, require the government to act as the sole provider. Generally, there is only one logical place for a single road, and there is logically only a few power lines routed to buildings, or one set of water pipes leading to houses. These are aspects of the economy that are not inherently a free market, and that is why the government itself may run many aspects of these and function as the sole monopoly provider. Although, it should be noted that there can be private enterprise involved in these government functions. For example, a private company may be involved in water plants and water treatment. Private companies themselves may run the power plants to create the electricity, and private companies may build the roads that the government uses taxpayer money to pay for. These are very obvious examples of ways that the government itself would logically be the only provider, because these are not strictly free market systems where competition could exist. It should be noted, governments are infamous for their ability to massively overspend on any projects or services this is responsible for. This is why it is important to keep the government's role in the economy to the bare minimum essentials, sticking to the services that the government alone should provide for all citizens. Number 2. The government forces socialism onto industries which otherwise would function as true free markets. These are not industries which are confined to fundamental restrictions, such as roads, but actually could exist as a free market system. Unlike previous examples, most other instances of government socialism are industries in which there could be a true free market. The most obvious example of this is the healthcare sector. The function of hospitals, doctors, and pharmaceutical companies are not functions that require a government monopoly. They would exist in a free market if not for the government regulation currently on them, which attempts to force arbitrary outcomes. Government interference in the healthcare industry only exists because healthcare has a moral aspect, unlike most other industries. But, as covered previously, government interference and socialism in the healthcare industry has done nothing but hinder successful free market outcomes. Another example is the education sector. This is not strictly an industry which requires the government to run it. After all, private schools already exist, as well as resources on the internet, which can be seen to greatly improve student outcomes while keeping costs efficient. It is entirely possible that competition between schools can exist because education is a free market and is not strictly required to be run by a single government monopoly. Also, it is important to note that public schools already spend anywhere from $15,000 to $30,000 per student, yet some public schools are infamous for their poor outcomes, despite the high spending. This goes to show how free market competition, rather than a government monopoly, can potentially benefit an industry such as education. Despite the fact that so much money is spent on each student, many areas in the United States have very poor school outcomes. This is because the government essentially acts as a sole monopoly in an industry which otherwise could be a free market, leading to better outcomes and lower costs. In summary, there definitely are industries and services which fundamentally require the government to pool resources and be the sole provider. In other industries, there are no fundamental limitations on a true free market system, so these industries could function in all the beneficial ways a free market does. When the government asserts that certain industries such as healthcare are essential rights, or that the government should run them for the common good, this unfortunately hinders the free market system, which would lead to better products and services and lower costs. The more free markets are allowed to operate without government interference, the more average Americans and those in poverty can benefit from the free market system. The U.S. government already operates as a socialist state in many realms of the economy. such as the healthcare system, the welfare system, and the social security system. As expected, these are realms that people complain about the most for their poor outcomes, highest costs, slowest execution, and lowest quality of service. Are the rich getting richer while the poor get poorer? Do people get rich because they exploit the poor? Is wealth inequality a great evil of free market capitalism? Wealth inequality and income inequality in a free market system is not a cause for concern. Proponents of socialism often point out the fact that billionaires exist, while people in poverty also exist, as an argument about how capitalism is evil and leads the oppression of the poor. This is false. Free market economics very clearly leads to everyone in the economic system getting richer at the same time. Firstly, it should always be remembered that the only way for a businessman to get rich is to offer immense value to the marketplace, meaning offering immense value to you, the average consumer. The only reason Walmart made its founder Sam Walton worth billions is because Walmart was a revolutionary business that brought more value to the consumer and brought down prices. Walmart operates at a profit margin of 3%, which is a relatively slim profit margin, but his business is so large that he was able to make many billions for himself. This is not an example of exploitation or some great injustice. This was an example of economic value increasing and prices lowering, which is a common phenomenon in a free market system. This is why wealth and income inequality in a free market is not a cause for concern. The fact that a millionaire or billionaire exists only signifies he was able to bring great value to the marketplace, and you as the consumer willingly chose to trade with him, and everyone in the system benefited. You as an entrepreneur or average worker are paid according to your value on the market, where you earn more if you bring more value. The richness of the average American should always be measured in quality of life, meaning the value they are able to receive for their dollar from businesses. In 2024, quality of life in America is sky high compared to any other time in human history, and even compared to many countries on planet Earth in today's time. The average American is often able to afford reasonable housing, cars, food, medicine, and technology like computers and phones, which is why quality of life is so high. All of these are ways that free markets have brought up the standard of living as recently as in the last 100 years. By contrast, whenever socialism has a government monopoly running sectors of the economy, you consistently see product and service quality drop drastically, while prices and costs remain high. In a socialist economy, everyone is poorer because the value offered by the business is significantly lower, yet costs on everyone are higher. In fact, socialist systems are infamous for the way that 99% of the population is dirt poor, yet the politicians in charge of these government-run sectors are rich themselves. Wealth inequality in a socialist economy does indicate injustice and exploitation, and the system overall leads to everyday citizens being exponentially poorer than in capitalist systems. Income inequality also does not indicate anything is wrong in a free market system. Imagine you are a shareholder of Walmart, and Walmart's annual revenue is $10 million. Now, imagine Walmart expands its stores and now the annual revenue is 10 times more, at $100 million. You as a shareholder, or a CEO, would now arbitrarily be paid 10 times more. Nothing changed about the business or the market itself, just the fact that the business operated on a 10 times larger scale. This simple math shows why income inequality is a false cause for concern. It does not indicate any moral failing or exploitation. People will also point out that rich people exist in the same system that poor people exist, and this will be used as an argument for why capitalism is bad for everyone. This is not true economically. As covered previously, the poverty rate in the USA has been steadily dropping over time due to capitalism. And importantly, just because someone is rich does not mean that they cause someone else to be poor. In addition to this, poverty can often be shown to be self-inflicted statistically, whereas people who make wise decisions in life can be shown statistically to live stable middle-class lives with stable incomes. For these reasons, it is absolutely expected to have both rich and poor people exist in the same economic system, and these two groups are not at odds with each other. Poverty will always exist, regardless of how rich society is as a whole. This line of thinking, in order to show why capitalism is a bad system, is completely misguided economically. Unfortunately, proponents of socialism use the fact of inequality to justify negative attitudes towards the rich, simply on the grounds that rich people exist. For all reasons mentioned, this is very misguided in an economic sense. In summary, income and wealth inequality does not indicate that free market capitalism is a bad system. In fact, the more millionaires and billionaires that the USA is able to produce in a free market system, the better it is to live in America, because that just means you have more access to valuable products and services. What about those who claim greedy corporations cause inflation? The truth is that inflation only exists because the government increases the money supply. Goods and services will always exist and have intrinsic value. The Apple iPhone always has intrinsic value, whether you live today or 10,000 years ago in the Stone Age. Money does not intrinsically have value. Money only exists in relation to the goods and services in an economy. If you have 100 million US dollars, but you live on a desert island with no good or services, your money is worth nothing. If you live on a desert island, where the Fortune 500 companies all operate, within a day you can create paper money and it will have real-world value. Inflation, by definition, can only exist because the government creates more money. Whenever the government prints 50% money, or said another way, the government spends 50% of the money supply, it simply prints more money and deflates your cash savings by minus 33%. There is no such thing as greedflation in a competitive free market. This is just a term used to criticize market forces that require prices to go up whenever input costs go up proportionally. Prices can go up and down dynamically. What about universal basic income? Can that help solve poverty? Another means of creating an economy for the future is the idea of universal basic income, where all people receive monthly incomes of X dollars from the federal government. 1. UBI would function exactly like welfare does now. People work less on purpose because the policy incentives create the outcome. 2. UBI would increase inflation. There would be less production in the economy and $1,000 per month sent to citizens. That is the definition of inflation. 3. A better policy, with good incentives and outcomes, is simply to give more tax breaks to working people. You keep more of what you're already working to earn, and working more earns you more. People who refuse to work would not receive anything. Should the United States adopt a more socialist system regarding the welfare, healthcare, and education systems, like those in European countries? European governments are highly praised by many for their vast welfare and healthcare states. Proponents of these systems argue that these systems are very desirable for the average citizen because the average person never really has to worry about losing their job because of the welfare safety nets or being unable to pay for their healthcare because of the nationalized healthcare systems. The reality of this view is that it essentially is arguing for more alleged economic security for the average person, but sadly at the expense of opportunity and freedom, and most ironically, with less desirable outcomes than in a true free market system. Number 1. You trade security for less opportunity and upward mobility. When tax rates are so high, it makes it very difficult, or near impossible, for the average person to save wealth for themselves in a meaningful way, let alone ever attempt to be rich. It is a trade-off of potential financial independence for extremely high taxes and alleged economic security. Another important aspect relating to supply-side economics is that as the tax rates get exponentially higher, the drive for entrepreneurship dramatically drops. And as covered, an economy where entrepreneurs are not incentivized to make as much money for themselves leads to an economy where an entrepreneur will refuse to create immense value for the economy as a whole, which negatively affects everyone, including the average consumer. This leads to a decrease in product and service quality, an increase in prices, and a decrease in availability. This is the trade-off of socialist-style security nets run by governments. Number 2. A free market capitalist system would greatly improve outcomes in highly desired areas, such as the welfare state and the healthcare system. As mentioned before, an increase in true free markets leads to improvements in quality, availability, and a lowering of price over time, because markets with free market competition lead to improvements in all three areas, unlike a system entirely run by a single entity, such as the government. When governments run these nationalized systems, you fundamentally are overpaying through high taxes and receiving subpar quality and availability of the service. This is the irony of the trade-off of the surface-level security of a socialist state. In an attempt to achieve prosperity for everyone, you ironically guarantee subpar quality for everyone, while running at a lower quality of service, having a more inefficient economic system, and more overpriced and heavily taxed socialist state. Proponents of a more socialist state would argue that they desire to, quote-unquote, remove profit motives and only care about the common good, leading to heavy socialist systems which end up with poor results. This is not how an economic system works. All of these problems would be solved if the system was allowed to be truly free market. What about the spending on the United States military? Is that a key factor for why spending is so high? While it's true that the U.S. military may be able to spend less money, and spending efficiency should always be a top priority, the idea that the military-industrial complex is a key factor for cost to the U.S. taxpayer is not true. The percentage of U.S. GDP that is spent on military has been consistently falling over time, being at its height in the Cold War from the 1960s to the 1980s. As previously mentioned, primary reasons for spending are healthcare spending, social security spending, interest payments on the United States over $35 trillion in debt, and many other factors. All these factors are much more important to the budgetary economic health of the United States. What about entrepreneurs versus the workers? Are business owners oppressing the workers of America? The roles of business owner and employee are inverse sides of the same coin. The business owner is responsible for all capital investment to start and run the business, and they will receive the reward for doing so, but they will also receive the risks if the business fails. Most businesses only make a conservative 10% yearly return on costs, and 95% plus of new businesses fail. Conversely, the worker is always guaranteed a steady income as long as the business continues to operate. The workers are only responsible for their realm of responsibility, while business owners are responsible for the entirety of the business. Should workers own the means of production? Well, firstly, the business owner may spend millions of dollars on creating a business, including its real estate and machinery to create a product. And just as importantly, the business owner likely has years of experience and expertise running a business in their specific sector. They receive much of the reward and also receive all of the risk. If the workers are entitled to the overall reward of the business just the same as the business owner, should they also pay the risk if the business goes bankrupt, as most businesses do? If any person is not interested in the pros and cons of either side of this exchange, they are free to join the side of the other. A common claim is that the rich endlessly hoard their wealth in their families for generations, keeping it away from the poor. The rich keeping their money stashed away is a method seen by many as a means to keep the population forever poor. Firstly, any family which accumulates massive amounts of wealth has a right to keep money they have earned, and not have it completely stolen from them, especially not for the sake of redistributing to others. If a good father is so diligent that his family is taken care of for generations, that is to their benefit, and no other people have a right to their money and security. Secondly, if a family did accumulate wealth, it is because, as covered previously, those individuals brought immense value to the marketplace, which benefits everyone. They received a smaller portion of money than they created for the economy as a whole. Thirdly, and most importantly, the vast majority of millionaires and billionaires in the USA are first-generation millionaires, not generational wealth inheritors. They are entrepreneurs and companies who started with nothing and turned it into millions and billions. An easy example of this is the big tech industry. In fact, inherited wealth is infamous for being so easily lost. Fortunes of millions, and sometimes even billions, can be spent right back into the economy within a generation of it being passed down to the kids or grandchildren of a successful entrepreneur. What about those who claim that the average American is poorer than ever, and that the average American is struggling more than ever? Dollar value is often used as measure of how rich or poor the average American is, but this by itself is not an accurate measure of how rich the modern American is. The primary measure of wealth is quality of life. By this metric, you can easily see that the average American has access and can afford unprecedented levels of wealth through the value and technology in their home, car, phones, and other important things such as healthcare and medicine. The average American is able to live on a standard better than kings lived just a few hundred years ago. While it is true that modern economic conditions can make it financially difficult for the average American household to save money every year, there are identifiable causes and policies that can greatly improve the financial situation of every American household. What about regulation? Does the free market allow regulation? A conservative economic viewpoint already allows there to be fair, common-sense regulation. For example, a corporation cannot pollute a river, and a corporation cannot illegally stifle competition in order to become a monopoly. These are simple guardrail policies that everyone can agree on and will cover the vast majority of the problems that may arise in a free market system. A free market system still allows the government to act as a fair referee. These examples alone should be the extent to which the government is involved in the economy, simply a simple guardrails approach to regulation that everyone can agree on. The government itself is not responsible for running the economy. What about monopolies? Shouldn't the government regulate the free market to make sure that monopolies aren't formed? Shouldn't the government regulate the market to protect consumer interests? In the recent history of American capitalism, monopolies have actually been quite rare. The idea of a structural monopoly that can't be fundamentally challenged by new competition doesn't happen very often. In fact, the last 50 years in technological progress has been famous for how fast technology is outdated. For example, with the way certain technology like phones were dominant and then were quickly dominated by new innovation like the iPhone, or the way that older social media websites were replaced by Facebook and other social media platforms. Capitalism and American innovation in the technology space in just under 30 years has seen monumental amounts of progress in technological value and reduction of price for the benefit of consumers. Government interventionism, which just means that government regulators have a heavy hand in every aspect of the free market, can lead to disasters of what would be a successful free market system. Number 1. Government regulation itself can be a primary cause of monopolies. For example, government heavy-handed regulation may make being an innovative startup nearly impossible, because the upfront costs and time required to comply with thousands of pages of government regulation and laws may be too much to manage, unless you have millions of dollars to pay for an army of lawyers. Whereas established companies, with billions of dollars in revenue, can easily overcome regulatory burden. These companies may actually prefer heavy government regulation, because they know it makes competition more difficult. Also, it should be noted that a monopoly is a company which has inherent structural protections against competition, which ironically is often caused because of government regulations. A monopoly is not just a company which has dominant market share, such as Google having 80% of the search market. And a monopoly is not the fact that, for example, 5 companies control 50% of XYZ industry. That is not an example of a monopoly. A monopoly is not just the fact that a company is large, successful, and has big market share. If this were the case, a company like Walmart would be an example of a monopoly in the early 2000s. As usual, the free market created lots of competition as time went on, with new competitors like local grocery stores like Publix or Kroger, up to large stores like Costco and Amazon. Another example of the government creating monopolies is when it comes to consumer protection government agencies such as the FDA. The FDA may have full control of whether food products or healthcare products and services get to the end consumer. For this reason, the FDA has the power to arbitrarily approve or disapprove of whether a product gets to market. This is an example of how the government itself can cause the free market to be a monopoly system where very few players are allowed to operate. As mentioned previously, when the government has total regulatory control over sectors like healthcare and pharma, or even the food industry, using tools like price controls, we see the complete destruction of the affordability of products in these markets, because they do not resemble a free market in any way. In addition to this, it should be noted that sometimes apparent monopolies can be formed because the business offers extremely strong value to the consumer. For example, Standard Oil in 1900, created by John D. Rockefeller, revolutionized the oil industry and brought costs down. For this reason, his company gained dominant share. Another example is Google Search in 2024. Their product has long been highly useful to all of its users, and that is why they have 80% of the market share in the search engine business. Although it's always important to remember that just because a company has dominant market share, that does not mean it's a monopoly. A monopoly is usually because of some structural anti-competitive practice, whereas having a successful business that wins out over competition because you offer superior value to consumers is not anti-competitive. Number 2. The free market itself is often self-regulating. For example, a food company will lose all of its customers if it gets a reputation for having food that makes people sick. An example of this was when Chipotle had an E. coli problem in 2015. Similarly, if healthcare products and services in a free market did not work, consumers would be able to figure this out themselves. On top of this, the burden of heavy-handed regulation can cause years of time to go by and millions of dollars to be wasted just trying to get a product approved by a government agency. Factors like this make administration of a business much more difficult and stifle innovation and cost reductions. Number 3. The more power that big government has in the economy as a result of regulatory power, the more potential for governmental abuse against private companies and private individuals. Another means of anti-free market behavior is the power of bureaucrats in the federal government. In 2024, the U.S. government had 438 federal agencies, meaning the power of the government stretched very widely across the entire economy. While Congress is responsible for creating laws, government bureaucrats in the federal government have the job of enacting the laws. By the very nature of government power, this gives government employees great power over companies, because laws can be interpretative, which potentially gives bureaucrats arbitrary power. When it comes to the free market, this essentially means that bureaucrats can enforce their ideology and desired outcomes onto the free market, which, as mentioned, leads to a degradation of the value the consumer is able to receive, because the government is forcing arbitrary outcomes and often creating entrenched monopolistic power. In the years of 2020 to 2021, we saw this effect on full display. Government bureaucrats, through formal and informal channels, were able to put pressure on private companies that otherwise would not have to comply with these government demands. Examples of this behavior include social media censorship at the directive of the federal government at places like Twitter and Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg wrote a letter in April of 2024 explaining that the government requested that specific content and specific posts be removed from these platforms. These are obvious and well-known examples. It should be noted that there are likely countless unknown examples that exist in the federal bureaucracy of the government structure getting away with unlawful actions, using powers that it was never granted by the law or the U.S. Constitution. The reason these private companies complied with these governmental requests was because the bureaucracy was inherently implying with the request that any private company that does not do the requests of the government would be punished with regulation, or perhaps even antitrust litigation. The implied threat of regulation was enough to force their desired arbitrary outcomes, often with political motivations. If the government did not have this overwhelming power over the free market in the first place, the government would not be able to coerce private companies into doing its bidding. Number 4. Regulation must be common sense and as minimal as possible. When it comes to regulation, it should be noted that the idea of more regulation doesn't actually mean anything is being achieved from a regulatory point of view. Only the quality of the regulation matters. It is entirely possible that sensible regulation for any specific industry may only be 10 pages long, whereas others may see that regulation is countless thousands of pages long, and would consider that to be safer for the consumer. This is not true. Endlessly complicated pages of regulation do nothing to protect the consumer, except causing business administration to become exponentially harder as they deal with regulatory red tape. Number 5. Government interference in the economy, through subsidies or corporate welfare and bailouts, is not a free market system. For example, the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act gave $128 billion in subsidies to renewable energy like solar panels and wind turbines, $12 billion in electric car purchase incentives, and many billions more for other related areas. Subsidies like this are not a free market system. They show favoritism towards desired political outcomes. Subsidies may allow a product or service to exist that otherwise would not survive in a free market. Many people criticize the government for showing favoritism towards corporations through means of subsidies or bailouts, while neglecting the average American. According to a free market perspective, it is true that subsidies and bailouts, also called corporate welfare, are not a true capitalist approach to the economy and are not fair to competing businesses and sectors. In summary, for all the examples mentioned, this is why the true power of government should always be kept in check, and it should stick to the core responsibilities that the government was intended to provide in the Constitution. If left unchecked, the government machine can steamroll any free citizen or free enterprise company that disagrees with them politically and force desired outcomes, using the power of the federal government. From a laissez-faire free market economics perspective, the government should have minimal power over the free market. There are clear roles of government regulation, such as the protection of individual rights. A company is not allowed to pollute a river or pollute the air, because that is an invasion of individual rights. But, as is the case with the vast majority of government regulation, the goal is force arbitrary desired outcomes of whatever the federal government desires, which distorts and twists the free market, which itself could self-correct and innovate to the benefit of the consumer. What is Marxism? What does Marxism have to do with economics? Although the economics debate of capitalism versus socialism is technically about economics, it is often also a debate about the beliefs of Marxism. Marxism is an economic philosophy created by Karl Marx that thinks of the world in terms of rich versus poor, the bourgeoisie capitalists versus the common man proletariat workers. It frames the rich as oppressors who arbitrarily hold power, and the poor as the oppressed working man who is poor because the rich are allowed to exist. It views the world through economic class struggle, with the rich battling the poor. It is often the worldview of communism and socialism in the modern era, which often argues for the collective ownership of property and wealth, such as in socialism. Marxism is important to understand because many people in the U.S. academic system, the U.S. mainstream media, and in U.S. federal government self-identify as Marxists or hold views about economics which closely resemble Marxist beliefs. As covered previously, capitalism is not an evil system of rich oppressors versus working man victims. Capitalism is the protection of private property and individual rights, where you are free to become as rich as you desire. A person only accumulates wealth by offering immense value to the consumer, which is often the working man. Capitalism is free trade and voluntary exchange of goods. In the U.S., most people will move between economic classes as they get older, and as they near retirement, they most likely will be middle class or upper middle class. The primary reason the modern world has a high quality of life, especially for the average American, is because of the power of capitalism to raise value for everyone in the economic system. Generally, in a free market, there is no such thing as economic class struggle. Capitalism is simply the right to private property and the freedom to spend your time and energy as you desire. Whereas with socialism, you do not have property rights or the right to your own money as you earn it. It is money for the benefit of the collective, and the government will decide how your money is spent. You must participate in government socialism and accept the services they force upon you, no matter how highly you are taxed for very little return, whereas in a capitalist system you are free to choose which services you want to spend your money on. As long as there is a true free market, where the government does not have arbitrary regulatory power to dictate how companies or individuals must operate, there is little chance for oppression of the rich onto the poor. Ironically, the fastest way for the average American to be oppressed by the bourgeoisie upper class would be to give the government as much power as possible, where they can then force you to operate as those in government desire. In socialism, the feared ruling class in Marxist thought almost always becomes the corrupt political class who holds all the power, because individuals do not truly have rights to their money. In summary, Marxism is a very popular belief, but is easily proven to be false. Capitalism is free and voluntary trade between individuals and companies, whereas socialism is a system of forced oppression of taxation and government services onto the populace. Why wouldn't everyone be in favor of making college free? Or healthcare? Do people just not want the poor to be able to survive? Why do economic conservatives defend the rich? Often in discussions about capitalism versus socialism, the debate is not about economics. The debate is truly about morality and whether society as a whole feels it is, quote-unquote, for the common good, or unjust, that someone cannot afford to go to college, for example. As covered extensively, the debate between free markets and government interventionism is easily settled. Every time a free market exists, we see massive economic improvements for everyone involved in the system, including the business, the consumer, the workers, as well as the government collecting more tax revenue. We see this in easy examples such as the competition between grocery stores, Walmart, Costco, Amazon, and others. None of these companies were able to make an oppressive monopoly, and instead, they all compete to give customers the best value and lowest price. The more capitalism happening, the more everyone wins. On the other hand, whenever we see government interventionism, which would be the government setting arbitrary rules, regulation, and forcing arbitrary outcomes, often framed as moral statements such as, "This will help the poor," we see disastrous outcomes. Regardless of desire to help the average American, you can never escape the basic reality of economics, which includes supply and demand. Easy examples of this include the fact that the 2008 financial crisis was entirely caused by government policy. The healthcare sector's massive sky-high prices are due to government rules, regulation, and forcing of arbitrary desired outcomes. The student loan crisis exists because the government intervenes in the higher education sector and gives out student loans. These are just a few examples of how the government can be shown to continually destroy economic value, most of all destroying the wealth of average Americans and poor Americans. This is why the debate of capitalism versus socialism is not about economics, it is about morality. People who favor government interventionism in the economy will claim that their position cares about the poor and needy and the homeless, and also that they are fighting the evil rich, who hoard wealth and oppress others. And also that anyone who doesn't want free services such as college, healthcare, or anything else, hates the poor. As you can see, all of the language used is about morality, not about economics. They use accusations about moral character, not arguments about economics. The irony of this situation is that if you wanted to help the average American and the poorest Americans the most, you let capitalism work and get government out of the economy as much as possible.